Bienvenidos, jóvenes académicos. In this video, we'll be discussing the revolutions of Latin America from 1810 to 1822. The big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is, what were the causes and effects of the Latin American revolutions? Before we get into the Latin American revolutions of the 19th century, I want to first review Latin American society because there's some terms that are critical to understand these revolutions. First, as you recall from our last video on Latin America, the Spanish and the Portuguese had colonized the Americas. They had divided their colonies into many rigid social classes called casas, and we took a look at some of the casa paintings which depicted an idealized image of some of these mixed race families. It's very complex the way in which Latin American social structure was broken down based upon race. Now, one's social status was tied to the purity of one's blood, meaning one's white ethnic ancestry, and also the location of one's birth, so whether one was born in Europe or the Americas. So the very top of Latin American social hierarchy were the Peninsulares. They were whites born in Europe. They were the most politically and socially powerful group, and they represented oftentimes only about 1 to 2% of the population. Below them you had the Creoles, who were white Europeans born in the Americas. They owned much of the land in Latin America, but they could not hold the highest offices. Those public offices were held by Peninsulares. Now, just looking at a Peninsulare Creole, you couldn't tell the difference between them. You'd have to know where they were born in order to be able to distinguish between those two groups. Now, Mestizos are below them. They are of mixed European and Native American ancestry. And in that same category, you had mulattoes, people of mixed European and African ancestry, more commonly found in places like Brazil and the Caribbean, where there was a higher slave population from Africa. And then at the very bottom, you had African slaves, indigenous natives, Zambos, who are a mix of both African and indigenous. They were all in this sort of bottom tier. Now, the estimated population of New Spain, Mexico, in the 1800s, just to give you a sense, we had 1% of the population were Peninsulares, 15% were Creoles, 31% were Mestizos, and an estimated 53% were indigenous Native Americans. So if you look at this, what stands out to you about the composition of Latin American society? Kind of ask yourself, well, who ultimately holds positions of power and privilege in this society? And the answer is really the 1% holds the highest status, but the people really with any kind of power within their society are the Creoles and the Peninsulares, people of white ancestry, and that would be about 16% of the total population. So we've seen this sort of breakdown before in studying revolutions, where we have a significant portion of the population who is both poor and oftentimes landless. So the less privileged classes, the Mestizos, the mulattoes, the blacks, the natives, they greatly outnumbered the privileged classes, the Peninsulares and the Creoles. So conditions are ultimately ripe for a revolution. But in this particular case, in terms of who ultimately is going to lead the revolutions, it's not going to be people from these lower classes. In fact, it's going to be the Creoles, who again are educated. They have land and they have wealth, they have social status, but they don't have the position of power reserved to these Peninsulares. And so if you remember in the Pac-Man, ultimately Pac-Man gets eaten by the ghost, not the other way around. And so it's these Creoles who ultimately will take power. But now, are they going to want a radical revolution? Are they going to want to see property and wealth redistributed within Latin American society? Absolutely not, because they have a lot of the wealth and power in this society. So it's going to be the Creoles, this 15%, who are oftentimes going to lead these revolutions with the help of the mulattoes, the Mestizos, and the indigenous peoples of Latin America. So the Creoles sought to expel the Peninsulares from power, but to ultimately keep their privileged position within Latin American society. And that's going to mean that these revolutions are not going to be particularly revolutionary when it comes to radical transformation of Latin American society. In order to understand the Latin American revolutions, you have to understand the context, what's happening in Europe. So this is right after the French Revolution, and Napoleon has taken power. Napoleon is going to invade Spain and Portugal, and that's going to weaken both of those nations' ability to maintain control over their colonies in the Americas. I mean, Spain and Portugal are literally occupied by Napoleon, and in the case of Spain, Napoleon puts his brother in power, Joseph or Jose Bonaparte, Jose the First. One of the issues that we have with Latin American revolutions is that we treat them all as one homogeneous group, when in fact the Latin American experience is very different for each nation that achieves its independence. Before we get into the Latin American revolutions, I want to clear up a common misconception among students, and that is that the Spanish and the Portuguese were able to exploit the labor of the native populations without any resistance. Again, we talked about the advantages the Spanish possessed in the form of guns, germs, and steel, but it's incorrect to think that the native populations didn't in any way resist Spanish rule. A good example of this, in the 1780s, there was a major rebellion called Tupac's Rebellion. Now, this was, again, 200 years after the Spanish first arrived in Latin America, but there were examples of this through Latin American history of native populations trying to rise up and resist Spanish rule. In Tupac's Rebellion, there was a native who claimed to be a dead Incan emperor named Tupac Amaru, and Tupac led an unsuccessful uprising, ultimately protesting Spanish taxes. And so Tupac led this revolution. He ultimately was unsuccessful. The Spanish captured him. They publicly tried to execute him by quartering. It was unsuccessful because apparently he had pretty strong body core, and so they ended up beheading him. But again, I want to emphasize that the native populations were not simply helpless, and that they did oftentimes resist Spanish rule. Now, when it comes to the actual successful revolutions, though, in Mexico, there was a Creole priest named Miguel Hidalgo. He begins a peasant uprising in the town of Dolores, where he is giving a speech, and he states, "My children, will you free yourself? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers?" That would be the Mexica or the Aztec people. "By the hated Spaniards. We must act at once. Will you defend your religion and your rights as true patriots? Long live Our Lady Guadalupe. Death to bad government. Death to the Peninsulares." So what Hidalgo really stirred up was just a mob, and they went out as kind of an unguided missile and started attacking whites, both Peninsulares and Creoles. Miguel Hidalgo reminds me of another revolutionary. I think they look a lot alike, Bernie Sanders. Hidalgo and his successor Jose Morales were ultimately captured, and they were killed by the Spanish authorities. And this revolution would ultimately continue on for another 10 years. In 1821, the Creoles ultimately were successful in allying with the native rebels. They were able to identify a common characteristic they both possessed, and that is they were both people of the Americas, or they were both Americanos. Mexico ultimately wins its independence from the Spanish by booting out those Peninsulares and claiming independence. And so we had our first of the major Latin American revolutions starting in Mexico. In South America, there were a number of revolutions that were led by two Creole leaders, José San Martín and Simón Bolívar el Libertador. Now, José San Martín and Bolívar led armies of especially native populations in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and Bolivia, which Bolivar is named after. And so these Creole leaders were able to lead independence movements across South America from 1810 to 1824. Again, they created an army that was composed of native peoples, but also mixed peoples with some Creoles. And they were successful at ultimately booting the Peninsulares and Spanish authorities out. Bolivar, after the revolutions were over, was very clear in terms of what his vision for Latin America was. He stated, in what's known as the Jamaican Letter, "It is a grandiose idea to think of consolidating the New World into a single nation, united by pacts into a single bond. It is reasoned that as these parts have a common origin, common language, that would be Spanish, common customs, and a common religion, that would be Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, they ought to have a single government to permit the newly formed states to unite into a confederation." So he had a vision for Latin America that was essentially a united Latin America, much like the government that was formed in North America with the United States. But ultimately, his vision of Latin America was not successful. He states in the Jamaican Letter, "This is not possible, a united Latin America. Actually, America is separated by climatic differences, geographic differences, conflicting interests and dissimilar characteristics. So we recognized that there was just simply too much diversity in Latin America in terms of geography, in terms of racial classifications, in terms of differences in wealth and property, and that those differences ultimately prevented Latin America from uniting and forming one single strong consolidated state. So Bolivar's vision of united South America ultimately never came true. Instead, South America broke up into smaller nation states that on their own lacked the resources and economic power of neighbors such as the United States. Now, the third revolution I want to mention took place in Brazil, and how this went down was there was a king of Portugal named King João. King João and Portugal were conquered by Napoleon's forces. And so King João needed a place to go into exile. And so he left Portugal and moved to his colony of Brazil. So Napoleon's invasion of Portugal forces the royal family to move to Brazil. Eventually, Napoleon's army is defeated. And so, not surprisingly, the people of Portugal wanted their king back. King João was actually a little reluctant to go back because, you know, Brazil is awesome. Eventually, the king did return, and he left his son, Pedro, in charge of Brazil. And Pedro decided what any kind of child maybe has a dream of doing. He was going to declare his independence from his father, the king, and Portugal, and a bloodless revolution. Eventually, the Portuguese recognized, well, we can't just go in and conquer our son again. And so they allowed Brazil to break off and to form their own separate nation state. So now we have nearly all of Latin America achieving their independence from the Spanish and the Portuguese. In terms of the effects of the Latin American revolutions, there's a number that we need to be aware of. First, the Peninsulares are going to lose power, right? Those Peninsulares, those Spanish officials and bureaucrats are going to be kicked out and have to return back to Spain, those who weren't killed. The Creoles, those whites born in the Americas, are ultimately going to gain power. So how revolutionary were these revolutions? Kind of similar to the revolution in the United States, and maybe in fact less so. These revolutions are not that revolutionary. Latin America is still a rigid and highly stratified society, separated by racial classifications. Yes, the very top of the social pyramid, the Peninsulares, have changed, and now the Creoles have power, but we still have a race-based hierarchy in Latin America that remains following these revolutions. And then finally, Latin America becomes, I would argue, a relatively economically underdeveloped region. We'll see examples when we come back to Latin America in the 19th century of a lot of examples where Latin America was undemocratic, where these countries were led by military leaders who refused to give up power. One of the unique things about the American Revolution was George Washington's willingness to give up power after 2 terms, right? This is a military leader who recognized that what was best for the country was the peaceful transfer of power. Well, that does not happen as often in Latin America. And so Latin America became relatively undemocratic. And increasingly, because of, again, the sort of relative small size and economic instability, we're going to see Latin America becoming increasingly dependent upon U.S. investment, and the U.S. government increasingly meddling and interfering in Latin American affairs. And we're going to refer to a policy of the U.S. government called the Monroe Doctrine. I like to call it the Monroe dog urine, because the United States is metaphorically urinating on Latin America in order to claim their territory until other European powers stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You know, this is a region that we are going to dominate and control. And so those are the major effects of the Latin American revolutions. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video is, what were the causes and effects of the Latin American revolutions? Thanks for watching.